Peter DeCarlo is a historian and has written some amazing books, some of which I don't have here today because unfortunately we got snowed in and I didn't get to the post office, but if you'd like to purchase his book, we'll have it in the gift shop here. I'll let him tell you what it's called. I don't want to give anything away there. He has an MA in American History with an emphasis in colonialism, borderlands, Native American studies, and the American West. He works at the Minnesota Historical Society as a research historian with historic Fort Snelling. Much of this story he's going to tell us today. So again, I won't give anything away there, but thank you very much for joining us.
Of course, yeah. Everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to finally be in Wisconsin talking about this history. It's the first time I've come across the river, and as we all know, a lot of history here ties directly over to Fort Snelling, right? So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that we're in Dakota and Ho-Chunk homeland, right? This is a homeland of an indigenous people, and I think whenever we tell these stories, it's really important to acknowledge that going forward, that wherever we are in America, in the United States, we're on the homeland of Native American people, right? And that history is deep and connected to the land. So the story I'm going to tell today, the title of the book is Fort Snelling at Bdote, and this story I'll be telling kind of follows the narrative of that book. And to kind of put the book and this presentation in context, a gentleman asked before I got started about a big project that the Historical Society has going on related to Fort Snelling. So right now we have a capital campaign going, trying to get some money from the legislature to revitalize the site, right? So the story the book tells, and this story is part of that. We're really changing the narrative, and I'm sure many of you have visited the fort and seen the history that's been told there. And though it's always been changing the interpretation at the site, the history that we tell, it really has this perception of always being stuck in the 1820s in the military history, right? And that history is still extremely important, right? It's an extremely important part of the U.S. military history in the area. But we're really focusing on trying to bring multiple perspectives to the site now and broaden the history, and to think of historic Fort Snelling as historic Fort Snelling at Bdote, right? So it's the story of the Confluence area, and it's getting beyond just the walls of the historic fort, right? So we're trying to broaden the story as much as we can. So that's what I'll be doing today. I'll be going through, it's kind of a history 101, telling a chronological narrative of the site. And I just want to let you know we will be, covering some difficult or controversial history, right? And part of what we've done as we're changing the way we talk about this is we're also using new terminology, right? Because if we change the words we use, we inherently change the way we think, right? So we're talking about a concentration camp that existed there in 1862. We're acknowledging and using the word genocide to talk about what happened to Native American people in the United States. And we're also using words like colonialism, right? So in the past where we would talk about the frontier, westward expansion, manifest destiny, if we phrase it within colonialism, which I'll help define, that really helps us broaden the narrative and tell this whole story together. So first of all, we're talking about people who have been in Minnesota for 12,000 years, right? And at the actual site of the Confluence, this is the oldest artifact that we have that dates to 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. So that's part of the story we're trying to tell now, is bringing it all the way back to the earliest human habitation and evidence that we have at the site. And in the past, archaeology has sometimes been perceived as a tool that was used to cut off, contemporary indigenous peoples from their ancestors, right? So Dakota people, Ho-Chunk people, the Iowa, they claim these ancient peoples as their ancestors, and they are, right? But archaeologists would call these people Paleo-Indians, Mississippian, Oneota, those kinds of terms. But those are just terms and names that archaeologists gave to these people, right? So there's no reason why archaeology and indigenous oral history need to be at odds, as they have been sometimes in the past. And actually, a lot of times, archaeology supports oral history and tradition and those claims to ancestry. So the people who lived here at the time, these are the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples that are in the region. And while we will be focusing on Dakota history because it's very important to the all the ties into the site, we do acknowledge that this site's important to Ojibwe people, the Ho-Chunk, the Iowa, the Oto, and Cheyenne. They all have ties to this place as part of their homeland. So to talk a little bit about the Dakota people. They are part of the Oceti Sakowin, or the 7 council fires. Many of us probably know of the Great Sioux Nation, right? So the Dakota are the Bdote, the Wapakudi, the Wapadan, and the Sissetuan, right? And I may not be pronouncing those perfectly, but those are the Asante or the Santee, or Eastern Dakota, right? And those are the Dakota bands that lived in this area and then up over into the Minnesota River Valley. And then to the east, in the present-day Dakotas and into Montana, were the Yankton and the Yanktoni, and then also the Teton or Lakota. So together, all those peoples today as well form the 7 council fires or the Great Sioux Nation, right? And they're all bonded together by kinship and language, their beliefs, and their customs. And Bdote in the Confluence area was really where the Bidawakatuan lived. So those are the main Dakota people that have a connection to that site, but all Dakota people are connected to it as well. And we should say that Minnesota Makoce, that is where the word and the term Minnesota comes from. That's a Dakota word, right? And it means the clouds reflected in the water, right? Or the cloudy water. So that's where the name Minnesota actually comes from. So Bdote, right? This is how we're using language to try to change how we talk about this place. What is Bdote? So that's a Dakota word that means where waters come together. So there are Bdotes everywhere. But the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, that is the Bdote. It's a sacred place to some Dakota people. It's where one of their creation stories is centered. So many Dakota people believe this is where they came into being. So it's a sacred site of creation. And that's something that we at MNHS are trying to honor. We're working with Dakota communities specifically to tell that story, and we're partnering with them so they can tell their own stories at the site. So that's why we're calling it Fort Snelling at Bdote, right? And we should also say that there are other creation stories. Within the Dakota people, they don't compel belief in one creation story. So for instance, Wakan or Lake Mille Lacs, that's another place that is a site of creation for some Dakota people. So it's just important to note that there are different sites of creation. This is one of them, and it's an extremely important one. And then Bdote is also used now to refer to, for lack of a better term, a sacred district or a region. So many of you may know St. Anthony Falls. That's also known as Owamini. So that is a sacred Dakota site as well. Carver's Cave is called Wakan Teepee. Pike Island, pictured there, is called Weetatonka. That's right at the center. And then Pilot Knob, which we were talking about a bit earlier, that the Dakota name for that is Ohe-Yawahi, and that is also a sacred site. So there are sacred sites all around Bdote that Dakota people have always been connected with, and they are now reconnecting with and protecting. So that's part of this story as well. Okay, so the fur trade. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned creation stories.
Right.
What does that mean, actually?
Right. So perhaps our easiest frame of reference is thinking of the Garden of Eden, right? Where in Christianity, where people came into being. So the Dakota people believe this is where they came out of the earth or came from the stars and came into being. So it's where the people began, right?
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the arrival of European Americans and the fur trade. This is a story that we've told for a long time at the site, but a way we're reframing it is a lot of times these stories are told from the view of European Americans, right? We follow the stories of the fur traders coming into the region, and we normally talk about it as if they're coming into a wilderness, right? And that implies that there was nobody here. But there were thousands of people here, right? And this was somebody's homeland. So we now reframe that as in European Americans coming into Dakota homeland or Ho-Chunk homeland, right? So it's just a reframing of that, right? So these people are coming to the confluence to somebody's land, right? In the Dakota, they made contact with European Americans probably right around 1660 or so. That's the first evidence that we have in colonial written sources of that contact. And they would have had fur trade goods even before they even saw European American, because the Ojibwe acted as intermediaries in the fur trade for a long time. The first documented European American that we know of that came through the confluence was Father Louis Hennepin, right? A lot of people probably know that name. And it's also important when we talk about this fur trade era that we realize the power in this relationship was really with Native people, right? Without them, the fur trade wouldn't have existed. This was their homeland. There were thousands of them and only a few European Americans at the time. And especially in the French era, there aren't a lot of Frenchmen here, right? So a lot of that power is with native people at the time. And then it gets into the British era of the fur trade, which happens after the French and Indian War. So when the French were in the fur trade, it was much more of a symbiotic relationship. The French incorporated themselves into Dakota kinship, and the British and Americans would do that too, but to a bit of a lesser extent. When the British take over, instead of a government controlling the fur trade as the French government did, the British open it up to capitalism, right? So businesses can become involved. So it's in this time when indigenous peoples become indebted to fur traders, and they get involved in a capitalistic system, right, which is something that they need to learn about, right? And then it's in 1823 when the American Fur Company comes to Bdote, and that's when the United States really takes over. And this is the most diverse part of the history of this site. For 200 years, this borderland culture existed, and some historians argue this is what makes Minnesota and also probably this part of Wisconsin unique, that for 200 years this fur trade culture existed and cultures were mixing. There was marriages between European Americans and Native people, and those families of diverse ancestry formed, right? So you can see here some examples of that diverse ancestry even in the material culture in that jacket there. So the United States arrives in 1805, and these are faces that some people here probably know pretty well, and this is the story that when you would come to Fort Snelling in the past, this is what you would see, right? Visually, this is what you would see. And for decades, the year that was aimed at to be interpreted at the site was the late 1820s, right? So that was what was always focused on. And these gentlemen here are Lawrence Tolliver. He was the U.S. Indian agent. In the center there is Henry Sibley. He came in 1834 and took over the American Fur Company in the area. And then we have Josiah Snelling, who the fort is named after. The first United States representative that comes is Zebulon Pike. He comes in 1805, so he came up the river. He would have come right past here. And when he got to Bdote, he landed at Weetatonka, or what we now call Pike Island, which is named after him. And in 1805, he signed a treaty, and it's important we put it in quotes, because it was actually an invalid agreement. He was sent here by his commanding officer. He wasn't sent by the President of the United States, so he didn't technically have authority to make a treaty at all. But that treaty then did go through the Senate. They set the money, the amount paid for the land without actually consulting the Dakota. And then the President at the time, Thomas Jefferson, he never proclaimed it. So there's a lot of technical reasons why the treaty that actually set the groundwork for Fort Snelling to be constructed isn't a valid treaty, right? So it's at this time where we would talk about Fort Snelling in the past as the Colossus in the wilderness, the speck of the United States out in the wilderness on the frontier. But this is where we can start using the term colonialism, right? So colonialism is set within imperialism, and imperialism is the policy or practice of extending power or dominion of a nation over another or over a territory, and sometimes this is through force, right? And then within imperialism, we have colonialism, and that's the policy of gaining full or partial control of the land and then taking the resources, right? So it's about taking the resources from the land. So that's what Fort Snelling really was. It was placed there with the main objectives of policing the fur trade, keeping the British out, and trying to keep peace between Dakota and Ojibwe, right? And the goal of that is to, if they're at peace, then the fur trade can move along. It was also there to keep settler colonists or immigrants off of indigenous land, right? But the reason behind that is so there isn't conflict, so the fur trade can continue. So this is all about putting a colony out there with the U.S. government, the U.S. economy, and the U.S. Army as the main arms of colonialism there, to not control the land, but extract resources and then prepare it eventually for land acquisition. So that's the way we're trying to talk about this now at the site. But it's also important at this time, as the United States comes in and we focus on that power, and the fort visually is a very powerful symbol, right? But this is a time when Native people still very much have the power in this relationship, right? So one good example is in 1820, Lieutenant Colonel Leavenworth, who was the first commander out there before Snelling, he was getting ready to build the fort, which began in 1820. And he was even unsure about Pike's Treaty. So in 1820, he decided to call a council. He asked the Dakota to meet with him, and they did. And they invited the Ojibwe. And it's really amazing. In the terms of that treaty, you can see the power of Native people. In particular, a woman of Dakota French ancestry named Pelagie Faribault, she's in the treaty, and she was given possession of Pike Island, and her family held it for decades, right? So in this story where, men dominate the narrative a lot of the time, and we think about the power of the United States, here's the power of Native people, people of mixed ancestry, and a woman, right at the center of this treaty. So that just gives us more context for the mixed culture at the time. And then another legacy at the fort that has not been talked a lot about in the past. It's probably been coming forward for the last decade, but for a long time, the story of African Americans and enslavement at the fort was actually omitted from the interpretation, right? So slavery was practiced here at Fort Snelling. It was illegal because of the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but it was practiced there nonetheless, and the main people who practiced it were U.S. Army officers. So Colonel Snelling, he did enslave people at the site. Lawrence Tolliver, the Indian agent, he brought 3 enslaved African Americans with him to the site as well. And the U.S. Army was actually complicit in allowing this and subsidizing it. So what happened was a U.S. Army officer received pay to maintain a servant, right? But a lot of officers at Fort Snelling, they would instead pocket that pay, and then they would enslave somebody and bring them to the fort. So the U.S. Army did know that they were enslaving people because the officers sometimes would write the name of the person and slave next to it, and they would still receive pay for it. So we're in this area where the U.S. Army really seems to be subsidizing the enslavement of people at the site. And slavery at the site really reaches its peak in 1828 when Colonel Snelling and the 5th Infantry leave, and the 1st Infantry arrives under the command of future President Zachary Taylor, and a lot of his officers are from the South, and enslavement reaches its peak at the site with approximately over 30 enslaved people living there at the time. And fur traders across the river at Bdote, some of them also utilize slave labor as well. So that's a story we're really trying to tell. And one of the main ways we do it is through the story of Dred and Harriet Scott, right? Some of us have probably heard of them, and their suit for freedom, the Dred Scott case in 1857 that helped lead to the American Civil War. Part of their argument that they should be free was that they lived here at Fort Snelling in free territory. And they actually met here, and this is where they were married as well. So that's a really powerful story that we try to tell. And before them, there were enslaved people that were women of color. Their names were Rachel and Courtney. They also used that argument to sue for their freedom as well. And as far as free African Americans at the site, the only known African American that we know that was able to escape bondage and become free at the site was a man named James Thompson. He was held in slavery at the fort, and he actually was freed by a missionary because he saw the skills that James Thompson had with the Dakota language. So he wanted to free him and then employ him as an interpreter or a translator, and he was married to a Dakota woman. So that occurred, and he lived at the site for some time on the military reservation, and he became one of the founders of St. Paul, actually, and helped found the city. So the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The Treaty of 1837 is really an amazing story because this is where all these diverse peoples come together, right, to negotiate with one another. So in 1837, the fur trade is kind of beginning to decline. There's some pressure for settlement. More European Americans are starting to press on the borders of Minnesota at the time. And Dakota and Ojibwe people are indebted to traders as well. So for the first time, they begin to realize that perhaps ceding land would help their people survive, right? And they start having to realize that land is commodified in this new capitalism system, right? So in 1837, a big treaty is held at Fort Snelling. So the Dakota are there, 1,000 Ojibwe come, An interpreter named Pierre Bonga comes as well from the Bonga family, which were fur traders of African descent that came from Canada. Dred and Harriet Scott are there as African Americans who are enslaved. Tolliver is there, Henry Sibley's there, so all these major players all come together at the fort. And the Ojibwe sign a treaty there ceding some land in present-day Minnesota. And then Tolliver was so angry at the involvement of the traders who were trying to get provisions in the treaty to get their money that he actually took the Dakota delegation to Washington, D.C., but then the traders followed, pretty much. So another treaty was signed in Washington with the Dakota, and this is the first time that the Dakota cede land in Minnesota. It's essentially east of the Mississippi River, right? And then the treaties in 1851 that some of us probably know well, that's the treaties of Traverse des Sioux, the treaties of Mendota. So this is where colonialism shifts into another term that we're starting to use, settler colonialism, right? So we've always used the word settler, but again, that's another word that implies people coming to the land and settling it, right? There's nobody there. It's open wilderness. It's open space, right? So to get away from that, we're starting again to use colonialism and then settler colonialism. So what settler colonialism is, it's native people are made to disappear from the land, right? So in 1851, the Dakota are forced to sign these treaties, and they cede the land, which is the orange portion down there. And then by 1853, they're all pretty much on the Minnesota River Reservation, right? So settler colonists are able to come to this land, and it seems as if nobody was ever here, right? So they don't even need to deal or think about Native American people. And there's a reason why, if you look in southern Minnesota, all the towns, when were they founded? 1853, 1854, right? It's after Native people are made to leave. And then settler colonists come, and what they do is they establish their own polity or their own sovereignty. So, right, they establish their towns, they put the plat maps out there, they divide up the land. Minnesota becomes a state, right, in 1858. So that's that idea of settler colonialism, right? So these treaties, a seminal moment in the history of the state. It's Alexander Ramsey and Henry Sibley who really head up the treaty signing process. So they first go out west to the border, present-day border of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and they sign the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux with the upper bands of the Dakota, which would have been the Sisseton and the Wahpeton. And then they come back to Bdote, and on Pilot Knob is where they sign the Treaty of Mendota. And by having signed a treaty with the western Dakota first, they then can pressure the Mdewakanton and the Wapakudi into signing, because they say, your kin have already signed this treaty, and you're going to be surrounded. So basically by immigrants and settler colonists. So eventually, through some coercive means, I won't get into the details, the Dakota are forced to cede their land in 1851. And then, of course, we don't want to gloss over the Civil War history of the site. It's one of Minnesota's most important, if not the most important, Civil War site in the state. All the troops that served in the Civil War were mustered in at the site and mustered out. And this is the first time that the fort expands beyond those stone walls, right? So buildings are expanded outside. The garrison expands. So it's a very important place in the Civil War history of the state. But the Civil War history in Minnesota is complicated because of its tie-ins with the US-Dakota War of 1862. And this is perhaps the most controversial or difficult aspect of the site's history. And we're also trying to be extremely honest about it, right? So this was a story that was not told at the site for a long time. And I'd say in the past 5 years and beforehand, but especially now, that's starting to change, and we're starting to tell this story in partnership with Dakota people, right? It's not just going to be MNHS telling it. It will be told with Dakota people, and we have a Dakota Community Council that is a full partner with us in the changing of the narrative of this place. So the US-Dakota War, really complicated topic, as many of us probably know, so I won't go into details, but the main causes of this war. So the Dakota are on the Minnesota River Reservation. In 1858, they're forced to cede half of it. So their land base is reduced. They're facing a lot of acculturation and pressure to assimilate. So there are divisions within the Dakota community. Some begin selectively adopting parts of Western culture to survive, right? So mainly we would think about farming, right? And then there's some Dakota who resist, and they would be thought of as more traditionalists. So there's divides and schisms within the Dakota people as well at the time. And leading up to the war in 1861, there's a crop failure. So when 62 rolls around, many Dakota people are starving. And I think we need to emphasize that, right? I mean, starvation. It's either perish through starvation or perhaps fight for your liberty, as some might view it at the time, right? Or many Dakota people probably did. So when the violence begins, this war, of course, was very complex. There's battles with the U.S. military. There's the attack on New Ulm, and we also can't ignore that approximately 600 civilians, white civilians, were killed during this war, right? So it's a brutal war. And to bring colonialism back into it, all those things that led to this war, the pressures on the Dakota people, those were, the umbrella over it was that colonial relationship between the United States and the Dakota people, right? Between the colonizers and those being colonized. So that's the way that we're starting to use that word as well. And we also can't ignore that this war was a racialized war, right? So when the United States responds, it's a war to exterminate Dakota people, to remove them from the state. But we also can't ignore that on the Dakota side, some Dakota people had internalized some of that racism as well, and they had set out to kill white people regardless of their combatant status, right? So that's something that we're trying to talk about as well. So the direct connection to Fort Snelling is the concentration camp, which is the term that we've decided to use, right? And we understand that concentration camp, for a lot of people, probably immediately makes them think of the Holocaust, right, in Europe. And we chose this term because of its accuracy, right? It's about the fact that the people in this camp were non-combatants, and the norms under which they were arrested and then imprisoned. Within a constitutional democracy, the due process really wasn't followed, right? So that's important to note. And we also want to say that we acknowledge, this was not a death camp. When we think of concentration camp and genocide, that's what people may think of. But nonetheless, 130 to 300 non-combatant people died in this camp as a result of their imprisonment there, right? And we can't ignore that. And MNHS has also come to acknowledge that what was perpetrated against Native people in the United States was genocide, right? So we're using a definition that was came about in the UN after World War II, right? So these are things that are perpetrated against Native people to, keep them or extinguish their indigeneity, right? So it's not only killing them, it's also trying to change their culture. And if you're indigenous, what does that mean? It means you're tied to the land. That's inherently who you are. So even taking the land can be seen as part of that genocide. So those are discussions we're having. We realize these are powerful words to use, so it's a discussion that we're having moving forward with the public. And we also want to make sure that we focus on the people who are in this camp. A lot of times when we talk about it, we say non-combatants and then we say women, children, and the elderly, right? But we really need to remember these were women and children and the elderly, these people who were here, right? So this is a story that it's about resistance and survival for women. It's a women's story. It's a story where children are doing the same thing as well. They're surviving and resisting what's happening to them. And also in the bottom right there, those are Ho-Chunk people. So the Ho-Chunk, their ancestral homeland was here, partially in Wisconsin. And they had been removed to Minnesota in the 1840s, then moved down to where present-day Mankato is today. And when the US-Dakota War happens afterwards, the US government and the Minnesota state government, they launch campaigns into the Dakotas to try to remove all Dakota people from the state, to continue the war. And part of what they do in the wake of the war is also use it as justification to remove the Ho-Chunk from the state. So at the same time that Dakota people are removed, the Ho-Chunk people are brought up to Fort Snelling, and then they are also removed from the state of Minnesota. So this is also a Ho-Chunk story as well. And then more difficult history. At the end of the war, we've all probably heard of the execution in Mankato, right, of the Dakota 38. And sometimes the Dakota 38 are called the Dakota 38 plus 2. And these are the plus 2. This is Sakpedan and Wakan Ozanzan, or Shakopee and Medicine Bottle. And in 1865, they were executed at Fort Snelling outside the walls. And this is, again, a difficult story. They had been involved in the war. To what extent, when we look at the primary sources, you really can't say, but it's likely, especially Sakpedan was very much involved in the violence. And after the war, they go west to join their kin in the Dakotas. And then as the United States begins sending expeditions into the Dakotas, they lead hundreds of their people north to Canada to safety, right? So they and their people are in Canada, and then the U.S. military in 1864 sends an envoy across the border, a U.S. military officer, and he basically employs some civilians to abduct these two leaders and bring them back to the United States. So they're manipulated. The civilians try to get them drunk, then they drug them, and they attach them to dog sleds, and they bring them back across the border, right? So there's these issues of sovereignty and the way they were even apprehended. And then eventually they're brought to Fort Snelling, and that's where they are tried and eventually executed. In their trials, we can say that they were unjustly executed, the due process, the legality of them. If you look at the transcripts, nobody who testified actually saw either of these men commit any acts of violence, whether against a civilian or even U.S. military personnel. It's all hearsay testimony, right? So those are things that we're trying to be very honest about, but also acknowledge that as far as their guilt or innocence, we really don't know. They could have committed crimes against civilians during the war, but we can't say it definitively based on the sources. So they were executed on November 11th, 1865, outside the fort. So that's something we're trying to talk about as well. So the Dakota have been removed from the state, and the story of their sacred sites continues, right? But one of the interesting stories that kind of illustrates what happens is this is St. Anthony Falls in the 1880s. So a site like that was actually harnessed for its power, right? It powers the lumber industry, then it powers the flour milling industry, and makes the mill city, right? It makes Minneapolis. It helps Minneapolis become what it would be. So a lot of these sacred sites, Dakota people are no longer here at the time to protect them, right? But that doesn't mean they were forgotten, of course. And in the 1880s, Dakota people begin to return to Minnesota in small groups, right? To return to their homeland. And then eventually 4 Dakota communities would be formed, or reservations that exist today. So these sacred sites, they didn't stop being sacred to Dakota people, but they were kind of incorporated into United States society, right? And one of them, like St. Anthony Falls, was harnessed in this way for its power. So after the Dakota are removed from the state, the story of Fort Snelling becomes a deeply military one, though it always was. And there are some wonderful stories and things that we should also be proud of, right? This is a site of pride, and it's a site of pain. And in this part of the site's history, this is when it was the headquarters of the Department of the Dakota. So that was a U.S. military department that extended out west into the Dakotas. So if we think of the era of George Armstrong Custer, right, when he was operating out there, this was the headquarters for that department, right? And one of the main stories that we're trying to tell is of the 25th Infantry here, which was a Buffalo Soldier unit, right, one of those famous units. It was a segregated U.S. military army unit. So that's another really important story that can touch at the heart of some major themes in United States, United States history. So we're currently doing research on this unit to try to identify some of the men and tell their stories as well, because it's a unique story to Fort Snelling too. So the World Wars, World Wars I and II. During World War I, Fort Snelling was an officer training school. So this is where young men came and trained to be officers to serve in the war. And we need to do a little bit more research here too. But as far as we can tell, it's pretty much definitive this was a segregated military installation. So no African Americans were allowed to train at Fort Snelling during the war. But it plays a pivotal part in the history of the state during World War I. And then in the upper right-hand corner, an amazing World War I era story is in 1918, Fort Snelling becomes General Hospital 29. And it becomes a leader in some medical practices at the time. It's what was called a reconstruction hospital, so a lot of surgical work, orthopedics, prosthetics. It was pivotal during the influenza pandemic that hit. And this is, again, another time where we can centralize the story of women, because it was an all-female nurse corps that ran this place. And they were pioneers in some medical history. They also educated a lot of the wounded veterans that came back, and they did recreational therapy and things of that nature. So that's an amazing story that we're really trying to bring forward and tell a lot at the fort. And then World War II. So during World War II, over 400,000 recruits go through Fort Snelling. A lot of veteran stories are tied to this place. And one story that we're trying to highlight in the bottom left there is during World War II, it was the site of the Military Intelligence Service Language School, which is kind of a mouthful. But this was where second generation, mostly Japanese Americans came and trained as Japanese linguists. So they would be code breakers. They were deployed to the Pacific Theater. They were there for the occupation of Japan. And this is a time during World War II where many Japanese Americans are held in concentration camps, right? So again, another story of citizenship, of loyalty to America. What does freedom mean? What does citizenship mean? And these second generation Nisei, as they were called, Japanese Americans, came here and trained right at Fort Snelling. Another really unique, powerful story that we're bringing forward at this time. And now we can also talk about the creation of this historic site as a part of history, right? So how did this come about? In 1957 and 58, a state highway was going to come through the site, and at this time, a few original buildings, including the round tower here, were in existence, and the site was threatened, right, with destruction. So citizens came together to defend the site, and the Historical Society, of course, became involved. So in 1958, we also had the statehood centennial. So a lot of people are thinking more about history, and with the site threatened, people came together with the society to protect it. And at the same time, ideas for reconstructing it coincided with the creation of the state park that exists there now. So in 1965, the restoration really began in earnest, and that went through 1982. And it was in the middle of that 1970 when it really opened to the public as a historic site. And as you can see here with the digs going on, this is where the vast majority of our archaeological evidence for the site comes from, these digs.
How much of it had to be rebuilt?
That's a good question. So the buildings that were still in existence that are original were the round tower, one of the batteries, one of the barracks, and then the commandant's house. So other than that, everything, if you visited, was reconstructed at that time. Mm-hmm.
Were they able to reuse some of the material, or did they just have
so they had to quarry new material, but of course they had the original there, so they matched it as closely as they could. Right. So this is another area where we can talk again about colonialism, right? What the powers that came together to rebuild this whole place. It's a fascinating story, right? It was the citizens of the state. It was the State Historical Society. State government funded it, right? And so when it was rebuilt, the story that was told there was the story of settlers, of European Americans, right? And stories that were attached to this place that didn't even quite make sense. So this is like, this is the story of people coming out west in their covered wagons. There's imagery from programming from them, and that doesn't even fit with the real history of the site, right? But it was that romance, that story that was told of the rugged American individuals coming out here on their own and conquering the wilderness, right? And then from the beginning, it was that military story, right? And when you would go to Fort Snelling, even in recent years, this is what you would see, and it's not that you're not going to see this anymore. We're still going to tell this story, but in a much more nuanced way, and it's not going to be the only one that we're going to tell, right? You have a question?
How were the Dakota people engaged in helping to kind of reframe the narrative?
Right, so that really began within the last couple of years, right? As we really in 2015 and 16 is when the push to revitalize this place occurred. And at MNHS, we also have now a Native Initiatives Department, and it's actually one of the leaders in the entire country. It's very innovative, so we have a whole department there to represent and do outreach to Native communities. And then particularly with the project to revitalize the site, we have the Dakota Community Council, which represents Dakota communities, and they can advise on every step of the process, including, from the structures that we plan on renovating to the landscape design to signage, but also the stories that we're going to be telling there, right? All right, coming to the end here. So again, as I mentioned, those sacred sites were still in existence, and Dakota people now more and more are reconnecting with these sites and attempting to protect them, right? And that's work that the Historical Society is trying to support. And we also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people that think this fort should be torn down, right? Some people feel that way, and some Dakota people, some activists and scholars have written on it, and that's where the banner at the bottom comes from, a campaign called Take Down the Fort, where people protested it and said, this is a celebration of imperialism, you're celebrating the genocide of my people, this is Dakota homeland, this fortification should never have been rebuilt, and it shouldn't exist, right? So these are, ongoing open questions, right? So what is the future of this site, right? And what is its legacy, even though it was reconstructed? How is it attached to the history of the place, right? So we want to be honest about that history, and we want to be honest about how we've told that story at the site and as we change it moving forward. So with that, I'll just mention that this is an ongoing project. On the top here you can see currently one of our visions for the site. The current visitor center would be torn down because it's old and leaking, and it would become an open landscape, and then we would have an orientation center to talk about Bdote, and then the new visitor center would be in one of the old cavalry barracks. And this image at the bottom really reflects what we're trying to do, right? You can see Fort Snelling is there, it's important, but it's the whole landscape. It's the story of this whole place. So we're moving towards historic Fort Snelling at Bdote, an entire site where we can tell all of this history in one place at a time. So with that, I'll close. Any questions or comments?
I want to go back to the Dakota conflict.
Right.
And that you've not mentioned it. And I think it's a concept, and maybe your commission is talking about it, but there's been, for hundreds of years, a well-developed concept of when warring parties war against each other. They don't necessarily have to even be imperial or a sanctioned government, that after the war is over, they're given amnesty, or they aren't executed, etc.
Right.
And that was totally absent from the Americans just pushed everything on the natives.
Right.
And there was no concept that these were warriors, soldiers of their own kind,
right.
Defending their homeland. And
right.
That concept has not been talked about. Is that now being?
Right, yeah. So you make a very good point. So at the end of the war, we need to think about, it's that issue of sovereignty, right? So all the trials that occurred, over 390 Dakota men were convicted in these trials, and then the 38, when Lincoln limited it to, all the transcripts went to Lincoln, and then he said he wanted to limit it to those who committed murder and rape, right? And that limited it to 38, and those were the ones who were executed. But the entire legal premise of these trials can be thrown into question, right? And it's how are we talking about sovereignty at the time? So that's how do we understand it now and in the period. So the U.S. government would have said that the Dakota people were dependents on the state, right? And that's how they framed it in the trials. Basically, all of them, if you participated in this war, you were guilty. And originally, those over 300 were sentenced to death for that. So it's basically sedition against the government, right? But Dakota people then and now would have said, we are a sovereign nation. We are combatants from a sovereign nation, so what right do you actually have to try us and then convict us and sentence us to death, right? So you bring up a really good point. The whole legal premise of these trials and the eventual executions is very questionable, and even if we accept the premise of U.S. military law at the time, which is what they were tried under, you examine the trial transcripts, you examine the trials, and due process, even within that legal system, was not followed, and Henry Sibley, who was the convening officer, he actually broke the law in some instances. So even within that framework, the trials, the executions were unjust, and we're being honest about that history at the society now. So thanks for your comment.
The website for the US-Dakota War is still live and
Yep.
functioning, and fantastic for pulling good information from it.
Yeah.
So if you haven't visited, I would definitely recommend that you visit that.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. And we also just relaunched the Historic Fort Snelling website with new content and new information there. So if you're interested in the history, or if you're interested in supporting, our campaign, our capital campaign with the legislature to tell these stories, you can go there and find more information as well. Questions, comments? Yes.
This is a story that I've never heard, so I really appreciate the context and the framing. It's really thought-provoking. I'm glad that it's been reframed over the last few years. What it makes me wonder, and I don't think there's an answer to this, but if you look back at the history as you told us today, it wasn't pretty, it wasn't nice. I think that, one of you walked away saying the Dakota people, the Choctaw people were wrong, and yet the forces of settlement and colonialism, they're kind of like an unstoppable thing. It happened here, it happened in other places in the United States, it happens still all over the world. So how could it have happened differently so that the outcome would have been better, would have been kinder? And that's why I say there's probably not an answer, but in what context the question?
Right.
What would the world look like today in Minnesota had it happened in a different, better fashion?
I would say there's not an answer to that. but those are great questions to ask, and I think the way I try to approach that is, we can't change what happened. We are living in the present, right? But we can re-examine our present, and then we can make our decisions on what do we want to do about it. So this is me speaking for myself, not for the society, but I firmly believe that this story, versions of it, were repeated across the country, right? So the genocide of Native people, and then I also think the enslavement of African Americans, those are two terrible things that at least myself, and I hope you can acknowledge that our country is built on those things, right? And it's not about feeling guilt or complicity, right? Because none of us were there, right? But we live with those legacies, and if you're a U.S. citizen, that's part of being a citizen. But it's also, that doesn't mean you can't be proud and love this country, because it's a wonderful country. We've done amazing things, right? So I think what it is, it's when you realize these things, if you decide to accept them as truth, this colonialism, and we live, some scholars argue that we're still living in a colonial state, right? Like, we're still here on Indigenous land, and so part of the work we're doing with Native people and that community engagement is trying to come to those answers. What do we do? How do we move forward together, right? So I think you bring up great questions, and I think as individuals, but then also like an entire institution can decide, like the Historical Society, how do we do that together? Yeah.
Well, I would have like 2 hours worth of questions. Honestly, and, since we moved to Prescott 10 years ago, I'm so trying to see. I can imagine the canoes down here, and I so want to find an artifact on our property 4 miles from here. I like to be out in the woods. I like to be out in the Mississippi, and I wish I could apologize to all natives somehow. I feel so strongly, and I saw you showed us the picture talking about the genocide of the photo that was taken from the fort down, all those teepees down there, and if you took 5 minutes and said, "All right, Joe, I will handle this," you could make us all cry in 5 minutes. If that whole story were told, if you just said, "I'm going to give you 5 minutes of what really happened here," to these people who surrendered and were told, "You're cool, you guys surrendered, stay out there," and then to have the men come down on the boat to bring them out, bring them by their families Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Explain part of that to me. Just to get out to South Dakota, they ran them down the Minnesota to the Mississippi, down to what? St. Louis or whatever, wherever you come back to.
Yeah,
Right.
It's incredible. And you know, guys like Wapasha and Lakota and Chaska and Shakopee, all these men that she's talking about, how could they have done this better? All those cats were like, they were sharing, and they were just, everything I've ever read, these were great guys who are just, we see it coming, but you know, we can kind of coexist, can't we? Don't you think a whole bunch of those guys were, and you know, when you talk about the difference between a guy like Sibley and Ramsey, Ramsey's comment was, we're going to exterminate them, that's it. That is the solution. Whereas a guy like Sibley, Henry Hastings Sibley, actually lived with, some Ho-Chunk peoples and traveled with them for a stretch. And he was a guy that was, talk about caught between a rock and a hard place in the 62 war. All of a sudden the government says, you're going out there to Fort Ridgely and you're going to round these people up. After he had been such a, don't you think, although he was one of the traitors, do you think he was more of one of the square traitors down here at Fort Snelling? You know what I'm saying? I don't know the details, but how do you feel about Sibley?
Oh.
You know what I mean? Because I give him a lot of credit, and then they sent him out, well, go out there, fella, you know what's going on, you round these people up, and you handle this out there.
Right. So that's a really good question. How do you feel about Sibley? So the way he's kind of really been talked about is, some of you may know the book Divided Heart, right, by Rhoda Gilman. So it gets to what you're saying, that idea that he was divided between these two things, he didn't know what to do. But if we look, at his history, he comes out here, he does marry a Dakota woman, right? But as soon as some of those treaties are signed, like in 1837, and in white European American society comes here, right? That idea of that mixing of cultures, immediately people like Sibley, Tolliver, Charles Eastman, they leave their Dakota wives, right away, and they abandon their Dakota families. So he left his Dakota wife, Sibley did, and he married Sarah Jane Steele, I think a year or two afterwards, and he did have a Dakota daughter. He did take care of her, but he didn't really, he sent her to missionary school. So there's complications there, of course. It's a complicated story. And then when the war begins, right, as he goes west into the Minnesota River Valley, he makes efforts, like he leaves a note on a battlefield and tries to say, surrender, you'll be treated with clemency, I only want those who have fought against the U.S. government or committed murders. But as it goes on, there's a quote of him saying that his heart was hardened, right? And many people would look at that history and say the divided heart narrative, they just flat out don't agree with it, or it definitely, that's not what he was by 1862. And again, making moral judgments about historical actors, some would say we could do that, some would say we can't, but in 1862, he fully went over to the side of, he convened the trials. He originally wanted to execute, over like 390 Dakota, not just 38, right? And there were times where the trial transcripts went to him, and when he broke the law was they went to him, and he wasn't supposed to be, involved in the decisions, right? Because he was the convening commanding officer, but some of the transcripts went to him, and he sent them back and said, I want a harsher sentence for this, and that's when he actually broke military law. So he fully went over to the side of extermination and retribution, right? And then after the war, he leads one arm of one of the punitive expeditions into Dakota Territory. He's the commander of the District of Minnesota when Sakpedan and Wakan Ozanzan are executed. So he's a part of all this. And so how do I feel about him?
Which part of his life, right? There's this part, there's this part.
It's really, he's an extremely complex person in the history of Minnesota, there's no doubt. So
I guess I got to read that book.
Yeah, it's a good starting point. Yeah, Divided Heart, yeah. Go ahead.
Real quick, I think your goal of changing the narrative is being successful. I think you've seen an example of that happening with the recent renaming of Lake Calhoun.
Right.
Do you see more of that coming as this narrative becomes more pervasive and people start to hear more of it?
That's a really good question, too. The renaming of Lake Calhoun, right, it caused a big stir. There's a lot of people that are angry about that. And to be completely honest with this project, so historic Fort Snelling at Bdote, right? So that's a sign out at the site, and we put that there to acknowledge it's on Dakota homeland. When you're there, you know that. But the site is still officially called Historic Fort Snelling. So even, you know, the Historical Society, where we're moving forward with this work, with more narratives being told, even the society is, you know, it's a delicate balance, because some people see that sign out there and they think, like, what are you doing to this place that I love? You're changing this place. And those are valid feelings, right? But the way I like to try to talk about this is, like, history is also about power. That's what I think. So who has told the story for a long time? And it's that typical, you know, the victors tell the story, right? And that's the case here. So ever since the society's inception in 1849, like, Ramsey was one of the founders. Henry Sibley was there. So whose stories were told? And then with Dakota people being removed from the state, they were not here to tell their story. So now they're coming here. They're back. We have a strong Indigenous community in the Twin Cities with our Native Initiatives Department now, and then with this specific partnership with Dakota people. They're telling their stories now. So, you know, putting the word Bdote at the end there, that's about bringing equity to the narrative, right? And a lot of people, you know, I've talked with people who they love this place, and they're tied to that military story, and that's a story we need to tell and always will, but it's the only story that's really been told. So when you bring new stories in, people feel like you're attacking sometimes their identity, which is, you know, I totally acknowledge that, right? But we're just at a point now where we're trying to bring as many perspectives as we can, as many stories and narratives, and sharing this space with everybody who it's important to. So I think within, you know, the public history field, this is the way things are moving. I think if, you know, whether we get the funding or not, we hope we will. Try to please support us. But this is the story we're going to tell, whether we get the funding for construction or not. And I think this is the way the whole field is moving now, trying to open our spaces up and not control the story so much ourselves. So, yeah. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
So it's really going in a great direction, I think. I think you guys are getting some momentum, and thank God for people like you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here.
No, for people like you, God, let's tell the narrative. Let's get all the stories out there. Let's see the big picture.
Right.
These people have been here 10, 12,000 years since the glacier's gone.
Right.
These peoples have been here. Let's get real about it.
And to give you, you know, one more example of that, so the story of Bdote, that creation story, right? That's really come into prominence over the last couple of years. Another wonderful book I would recommend is Minnesota Makoce. That's a book that's a Dakota history of this land, right? So there's just wonderful Dakota history there. So that book came out, and it really, really brought the story forward in the last couple of years. And some people say, like, you know, some people even say things like, what is this Bdote thing? Like, it's just coming out in the last couple of years. I don't trust it. You know, it doesn't make sense to me. Why, if this story is hundreds, thousands of years old till time immemorial, and why hasn't this story been here? And it's like, the story has always been here. It's just been with Dakota people, and now we're at a place where they felt comfortable telling it and sharing it. And so we need to respect that oral history as just as important as something written on a document, right? You know, a written source. So that's just another example of stories being told and shared, right?
Do you think that the 150th anniversary of the conflict, perhaps, was that a changing date? And I don't want you to answer, I want to add more. I went to New Ulm and spent time there, and there were a lot of new books. I was like a kid in a candy store, written in commemoration of the 150th anniversary, and it seemed like there were some new perspectives espoused in some of those. One that I was exceedingly upset with. But I had two ancestors that were killed by the natives down in Cortland.
Right.
And my family narrative was they were starving. That's what I grew up with. One of the authors of one of those books, and he wrote one lately, I shared with him the direct narrative of the husband or the wife of the husband who was killed that I had a written record of. And I gave him permission to use it because he wanted to follow up with the book later on of first-hand accounts. And but the vilification, I mean, here's somebody 150 years later is still grinding an axe for something that, well, upset me. But
Right.
it just adds to your concept of how people absorb it, take it, want to stick with it,
Right.
Want to look at a greater picture of what you're telling me, but now we're looking with a broader field of vision.
Right.
I just wanted to say that.
No, that's a great comment. Yeah, this history still matters a whole lot to a lot of people, right? And there's lots of different views, and we want to acknowledge them all and respect them all, and some of them become fairly extreme at times, right? Like vilification sometimes. But that doesn't mean we can ignore the horrible things that happen, right? Yeah, of course. So, any other comments?
And Lincoln saved a lot of lives at the last minute, right? I mean, didn't they want to hang 300 people or something? Lincoln goes, this, we can't have this. You know what I mean? So
Right.
he stepped in and said, no, it's going to be 30 or whatever the number was. Wow.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm not really sure how to ask it. Because it's just really hard to wrap my brain around so much of this stuff. But some of the stories are kind of classic dehumanization, vilification stories. And then there's, I guess recently I've read a couple articles about, like, there's something so essential about some people's humanity that, like, I have to squash it. Do you have to get to the heart of each story to kind of figure that out? I mean, I just don't really understand some of this stuff. Is it part of the human condition? I don't get it. I really don't, especially all the stuff that's in the news right now.
Yeah. So you're asking, how does humanity get to this point? How do? Okay. So I think we're going to get into some difficult stuff.
How do you deal with those sorts of questions? I guess maybe as an organization, is it easier to frame it in, like, how do you deal with those questions?
So I would say, even a big institution like the Minnesota Historical Society struggles with those things, telling this history, because why is this so difficult? It's because it's the story of humanity, and we're all human and can feel it and can feel empathy for people in the past, right? And our whole goal is to learn about the past, to affect people in the present, so we can make a better future together, right? Like that's what I think telling history and public history is all about. And to me personally, why I practice history as a historian, my main goals are, I believe in history that's active, that can change people. Like, I just don't want to tell a story. I want to tell a story with a message and make an argument behind it. So to me, I would personally tell these stories to show you horrible things have happened, but they were all constructed and were part of structures, right? And some of those still exist today, like racism, right? Oppression in different forms. But if we realize how the past has created our present, we can see that the future doesn't need to be this way, right? And we can avoid doing things like this. So, but that requires really frank discussions about genocide, right? About racism, right? Which is race isn't a biological fact. It's something that humanity created, right? We made it in society, right? But race is also really important because it's part of people's identities now, right? So we can't do away with racism or the idea of race, but it's how do we acknowledge it together and then move forward, hopefully beyond it. So these are deeper discussions, but hopefully telling these stories can help people individually and collectively try to see the truth and move forward together. I guess that's what I think, right? But bring up a really great topic, right? That's why this is so difficult, because it's about us, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thanks, everybody.
I can buy your book right now, but if it's not going to
It'll be here. It'll be here.
buy your book.
Right. And we glossed over a lot of the stuff, so the details are in there. But